The town of Maple Hollow seemed idyllic at a glance. Nestled in a valley, it boasted streets lined with sugar maples that glowed in fiery hues of orange and red during autumn. Cobblestone sidewalks wound past cozy shops with hand-painted signs, and the scent of freshly baked bread from Martha's Bakery often drifted down Main Street. Yet for Nathaniel Hayes, Maple Hollow felt like a gilded cage. Nate woke every morning in his modest, weathered house at the edge of town, the creak of old floorboards underfoot reminding him of its disrepair. The place had been his parents', and though he hated the memories it held, he hadn't the heart or the means to leave it. He walked to work each day under the weight of his own judgments, the young mother scolding her child on the corner. Too impatient to be a good parent, he'd think. The businessman barking orders into his phone? Another entitled jerk. It was easier to keep the world at arm's length. The small woodworking shop where he worked was tucked behind the hardware store. The owner, Mr. Crandall, was a kindly man who left Nate to his own devices. Nate appreciated that. He preferred silence to small talk. The rhythmic hum of saws and the scent of fresh cedar were his comfort. That day, as Nate walked to the diner for his usual lunch, he spotted a man standing near the door. The stranger wore a frayed jacket and had a weathered face, his eyes scanning the sidewalk nervously. Nate immediately pegged him as trouble. "Probably looking for a handout," he muttered to himself, gripping his wallet instinctively as he passed. The man looked up and met Nate's gaze. "Excuse me, sir," he began, but Nate brushed past without a word. Inside, the diner buzzed with chatter and the clink of silverware. Nate sat at the counter, as he always did, and ordered his usual black coffee and a BLT. As he waited, he couldn't help but glance out the window at the man, who now stood hunched against the chill. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled, and the man stepped inside. The room quieted slightly as heads turned, then quickly went back to their conversations. Nate stiffened, expecting him to start begging. Instead, the man walked to the counter and placed a crumpled $5 bill in front of the waitress. "Just coffee, please," he said softly. The waitress, Jenna, hesitated, her brow furrowing. "You sure you don't want something to eat?" The man shook his head. "No, thank you. Just coffee." As Jenna poured his cup, Nate felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Guilt? Shame? He sipped his coffee, willing the feeling away. A moment later, a large, booming voice cut through the diner. "Hey, buddy!" It was Mark Donovan, the owner, striding out from the kitchen. "You don't just get coffee in my place. Sit down." The man blinked in surprise. I don't have enough." "Don't care," Mark interrupted, waving him toward a booth. "You're eating today." Nate watched as the man hesitated, then slowly took a seat. Mark barked orders at Jenna to bring him a full meal, refusing to take no for an answer. "Kindness is free," Mark declared, slapping the man on the back before returning to the kitchen. The scene left Nate unsettled. He couldn't stop thinking about the man's grateful expression or Mark's effortless generosity. As Nate paid his bill and left the diner, he glanced at the booth where the man sat, now eating ravenously. Their eyes met briefly, and the man nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of thanks. Nate walked back to work in silence, his thoughts a storm of discomfort and reflection. Why had he been so quick to assume the worst about the man? And why had Mark's kindness felt like a rebuke, even though it wasn't directed at him? That night, Nate sat at his kitchen table, the empty hum of the house pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt something shift, a crack in the walls he'd built around himself. And it all started with a small act of unexpected kindness. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the kind of day that mirrored the heaviness Nate felt in his chest. He trudged to work as usual, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn coat. The encounter at the diner lingered in his mind like a faint echo. He tried to shake it off as he stepped into the familiar scent of wood shavings and sawdust at the workshop. The rhythmic hum of the saws provided some comfort, but his thoughts still wandered. By noon, he had managed to push the memory aside, focusing instead on sanding the intricate edges of a rocking chair he was finishing for a customer. But as he headed to the diner for his lunch break, he noticed something unusual on his route. Near the corner florist shop, an elderly woman was struggling with a large crate of flower pots. She looked frail, her stooped frame trembling slightly as she tried to lift the box. Nate hesitated. Normally, he would have walked by, perhaps muttering to himself about the recklessness of someone her age attempting such a task. But today, something stopped him. Maybe it was the man at the diner, or Mark's booming voice still echoing in his mind. With a sigh, he crossed the street. "Here, let me help," he said gruffly, reaching for the box before she could protest. The woman looked up, startled, her kind, wrinkled face breaking into a warm smile. "Oh, thank you, dear. I didn't think I'd manage this on my own." Nate nodded, the weight of the box surprisingly light in his hands. "Where do you want it?" "Just inside the shop, on the counter," she said, leading the way into the small florist's store. The shop was cozy, filled with the mingling scents of roses, lavender, and damp earth. Brightly colored blooms spilled from every corner, creating a vibrant, almost magical atmosphere. Nate placed the crate where she directed, brushing dirt from his hands. "You've got a lovely place here," he said awkwardly, not used to making small talk. "Thank you," she replied, her eyes crinkling as she smiled. "I'm Rosemary Blake, but everyone just calls me Rose. And you are?" "Nate. Nathaniel Hayes." "Well, Nate, I owe you a cup of tea at the very least for your help," she said, already bustling toward a small kettle in the corner. "Oh no, I couldn't," he began, but Rose waved him off. "Nonsense. It's a chilly day, and I don't often get visitors who aren't here to buy flowers. Humor an old woman." Reluctantly, Nate found himself seated on a stool by the counter. The kettle whistled, and soon Rose handed him a steaming mug of tea. He sipped it cautiously, the warmth seeping into his fingers as he held the cup. "So, Nate," Rose said, settling into a chair across from him, "what brings you to Maple Hollow?" "I've always been here," he replied. "Grew up just outside town." "And what keeps you here?" she asked, her tone curious but gentle. He shrugged, unsure how to answer. "Work, I guess. Family's gone. Don't have much reason to leave." Rose tilted her head, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "You seem like a man who carries a heavy burden." Nate stiffened, not liking how easily she seemed to see through him. "Don't we all?" he muttered, setting his cup down. Rose chuckled softly. "I suppose so. But some of us find ways to lighten the load. Others, well, they just let it grow heavier." Her words struck a nerve, and Nate shifted uncomfortably. "I should get going," he said abruptly, standing up. Rose didn't try to stop him. Instead, she smiled knowingly. "You're welcome here any time, Nate. And remember, sometimes it's not the load that breaks us. It's how we carry it." Nate left the shop, feeling unsettled, her words echoing in his mind as he walked back to the diner. Long at the diner, he ordered his usual and sat in his regular spot at the counter. But instead of the familiar comfort of routine, he felt restless. He glanced around, noticing the man from the previous day wasn't there. He found himself wondering about him, where he'd come from, what his story was. "More coffee?" Jenna's voice broke through his thoughts. He nodded, and she refilled his cup, giving him a curious look. "You okay today, Nate? You seem distracted." "Just thinking," he replied shortly. Jenna raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. That evening, as he sat alone in his quiet house, Nate found himself staring at the box of photographs he kept tucked away in the closet. He hadn't looked through them in years, unable to face the memories they held. But now, something compelled him to open it. The first photo he pulled out was of his father, standing proudly in front of the old workshop they had built together. His father had been a good man, kind and patient. But life had dealt him a series of cruel blows, and he'd turned to the bottle for solace. Nate's jaw tightened as he placed the photo aside. Next came a picture of his mother, her soft smile radiating warmth. She'd been the glue that held their family together, but her illness had taken her far too soon. He shoved the photos back into the box, unable to bear more. But as he closed the lid, Rose's words came back to him once again. For the first time in years, Nate wondered if he'd been carrying his own burdens the wrong way. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was close. The next morning, the first frost of the season painted Maple Hollow in delicate white. Nate Hayes zipped up his old leather jacket against the chill, his breath fogging the air as he walked toward town. His boots crunched on the gravel path, a sound he usually found soothing, but today it grated against the restless hum in his mind. The image of the man at the diner lingered like a smudge on his thoughts. It wasn't the man's face, weathered and weary, that haunted him. It was Mark Donovan's act of kindness, so effortless, so immediate. The moment replayed itself, an irritating reminder of something Nate couldn't quite name. He reached the workshop early, letting himself in before the others arrived. The stillness of the room, filled with half-finished projects and the familiar scent of cedar, usually calmed him. He ran a hand along the edge of a table he'd been working on, appreciating the smoothness. But even the tactile comfort of his work couldn't shake his unease. By mid-morning, Nate decided he needed a break. He grabbed his coat, telling Mr. Crandall he'd be back in an hour. "Take your time, Nate," the older man said. "You've been working hard this week." As he walked through town, Nate passed by the florist shop on the corner. He'd walked by it countless times without giving it a second glance. The storefront was cheerful, with hand-painted signs reading "Fresh bouquets daily" and "Bringing bloom to your day." Today, though, something caught his eye. An elderly woman was standing outside, struggling to pull a heavy crate of pots through the doorway. Her thin arms strained as she heaved, her breath coming in visible puffs. Nate hesitated, his first instinct to keep walking. But the memory of Mark's booming voice echoed in his mind. Kindness is free. With a sigh, he turned and crossed the street. "Ma'am, let me get that for you," he said, his voice gruff. The woman looked up, startled, then smiled. Her face was a web of fine lines, her eyes bright and warm. "Oh, bless you, young man. I thought I could manage, but these old bones aren't what they used to be." Nate hoisted the crate easily, its weight surprising him, lighter than it looked. "Where do you want it?" "Right inside on the counter if you don't mind," she said, stepping aside to let him through. The shop was small but vibrant, bursting with color and life. Shelves overflowed with potted plants, vases, and gardening tools. The air smelled of roses and damp soil, a sharp contrast to the crisp chill outside. Nate set the crate down carefully on the counter. "There you go," he said, brushing the dirt from his hands. "You're a kind soul," the woman said. "Not many would stop to help these days. What's your name, dear?" "Nate Hayes," he replied, feeling a bit awkward under her grateful gaze. "Well, Nate, I'm Rose Blake. You've earned yourself a cup of tea for that good deed. Sit down while I put the kettle on." "Oh, Nate started to protest, but Rose waved him toward a small wooden chair near the counter. "No arguing," she said firmly, bustling toward the kettle. Nate sat reluctantly, glancing around the shop as Rose prepared the tea. He wasn't used to places like this, bright, cheerful, filled with delicate things. Yet it reminded him of his mother's old garden, the one she'd tended so lovingly before her illness. Rose returned with 2 steaming cups and placed one in front of him. "Here you go. Nothing fancy, just black tea, but it'll warm you up." "Thanks," Nate muttered, wrapping his hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into his fingers, thawing them from the morning's cold. "So, Nate, "What brings you to Maple Hollow?" Rose asked, settling into the chair across from him. "I've always been here," he said. "Born and raised." "And what keeps you here?" she pressed gently. He hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Work, I guess. Family's gone. Not much reason to leave." Rose nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it's not about where you are, but what you make of it. Maple Hollow's a good place for new beginnings, if you let it be." Nate didn't respond, sipping his tea instead. Rose's words unsettled him, though he wasn't sure why. After a moment of silence, she added, "You know, it's easy to carry the weight of the past without realizing how heavy it's become. Sometimes it helps to set it down, even if just for a moment." Her words struck a nerve, and Nate shifted in his chair. "Thanks for the tea," he said abruptly, standing up. "I should get back to work." Rose smiled warmly, unbothered by his abruptness. "You're welcome any time, Nate. Remember, not all burdens are meant to be carried alone." As he walked back to the workshop, Nate replayed their conversation in his mind. He didn't like how easily she'd read him, like she'd glimpsed the scars he worked so hard to hide. The afternoon passed slowly, and by the time Nate left work, the sky was streaked with purple and gold. Instead of heading straight home, he found himself wandering. His feet led him to the park on the edge of town, where the trees formed a quiet canopy over the winding paths. He sat on a weathered bench, watching the last leaves fall. The loneliness he usually carried felt sharper tonight, like an ache he couldn't ignore. His thoughts drifted to the photographs tucked away in the box at home. He hadn't looked at them in years. It was easier to leave them hidden, along with the memories they held. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rose's words came back to him. Sometimes it helps to set it down. For the first time in years, Nate wondered if he'd been carrying his own burdens the wrong way. And for the first time, he felt a faint flicker of something unfamiliar. Not hope, not yet, but something close. The next morning, the sky was overcast, and a fine mist clung to Maple Hollow like a veil. Nate Hayes trudged into the workshop, his boots leaving damp prints on the sawdust-covered floor. The familiar smells of wood and varnish welcomed him, but the comfort they usually brought felt muted. Mr. Crandall greeted him with a nod from his desk in the corner. "Morning, Nate. Got someone new starting today. Could use your help showing him the ropes." Nate frowned, already dreading the idea of breaking his routine. "New guy? What's the job?" "Helper. Just the basics. Carrying supplies, cleaning up." "Name's Eli Carter. He'll be here any minute," Mr. Crandall said, turning back to his ledger. Nate didn't respond, his mood darkening. In his experience, helpers rarely lasted. They were usually more trouble than they were worth, lazy, unfocused, or just plain unreliable. The door creaked open, and a wiry young man stepped in, looking around nervously. He wore a threadbare hoodie, his jeans scuffed and too short, exposing thin ankles. His face was pale, his dark hair unkempt. "Eli Carter?" Mr. Crandall asked, standing to shake his hand. "Yes, sir," Eli replied, his voice quiet. "Nate here will show you what to do." "Nate?" Reluctantly, Nate walked over, sizing Eli up. The kid couldn't be more than 19, and he already looked overwhelmed. "Follow me," Nate said curtly, gesturing for Eli to come along. Eli trailed behind as Nate led him to the back of the workshop. He pointed to a pile of lumber stacked unevenly by the wall. "First job, sort this. By size, then type of wood. Don't mess it up." Eli nodded quickly, his eyes darting to the pile. "Got it." Nate watched for a moment, expecting to see hesitation or laziness. Instead, Eli rolled up his sleeves and got to work, his thin arms straining as he moved the heavy planks. Nate turned away, unwilling to admit he was mildly impressed. "Beaky." As the day wore on, Nate noticed small things about Eli. The kid worked hard, harder than most, and didn't complain, even when the tasks were tedious. but there was a nervous energy about him, a tension that never seemed to leave his shoulders. By lunchtime, Nate was still skeptical. Hard work didn't always mean reliability. People like Eli, he thought, usually came with baggage. Eli sat alone at a small table near the back, unwrapping a sandwich from a brown paper bag. Nate saw him glance around the workshop, as if trying to gauge whether he was doing things right. "You'll get used to it," Nate said gruffly, as he walked past, surprising himself. Eli looked up, startled, but managed a small smile. "Thanks, it's a nice place. Better than the last few jobs I had." Nate hesitated. "Where'd you work before this?" Eli's smile faltered. "Here and there. Nothing steady. Just trying to get by, you know?" Nate nodded, but didn't press further. He recognized the guarded tone, the kind people used when they didn't want to share too much. Restons son d'ordiam. By the end of the week, Eli had proven he wasn't afraid of hard work, but something about him still nagged at Nate. The kid was polite to a fault, eager to please, but there was a fragility beneath the surface, like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. On Friday afternoon, Nate found Eli sitting on a stool in the corner, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The workshop's old heater had given out, and the chill had seeped into the air. "You're doing fine, kid," Nate said abruptly, startling Eli. "Thanks," Eli replied, his voice cautious. "You'll stick around, right? Crandall doesn't have time for quitters." Eli looked down, fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. "I don't plan to quit." Nate narrowed his eyes. "Plans don't mean much if you can't follow through." Eli's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood and grabbed the broom, sweeping the floor with determined strokes. Nate watched him for a moment before turning back to his own work. That evening, as Nate locked up the workshop, he spotted Eli standing outside, staring at the sky. The mist from the morning had turned into a steady drizzle, and the streetlights cast a hazy glow over the wet pavement. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" Nate asked, pulling his collar up against the rain. Eli flinched, then shrugged. "Yeah, just needed a minute." Nate studied him, noticing the way Eli's hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. "Get out of the rain, kid," Nate said, his tone softer than he intended. Eli nodded and walked off into the night, his figure quickly swallowed by the mist. Just a ting the next morning, Nate stopped by the diner for breakfast before heading to work. As he sat at the counter, Jenna greeted him with a warm smile. "Morning, Nate. Usual?" "Yeah," he said, pulling out his wallet. As he waited for his coffee and eggs, he couldn't help but think about Eli. Something about the kid reminded him of himself at that age, lost, unsure, and carrying too much weight on his shoulders. Mark Donovan, the diner's owner, walked out from the kitchen and clapped Nate on the back. "How's it going, Hayes? Heard you've got a new guy at the workshop." "Eli," Nate replied. "Kid works hard, but I don't know. Something's off." Mark nodded knowingly. "Sometimes it's the ones with the hardest pasts who work the hardest. Give him time." Nate sipped his coffee, unsure whether to agree. Time wasn't always a cure. By the time Nate arrived at the workshop, the rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and fresh. Eli was already there, sweeping the walkway outside. He looked up and gave Nate a tentative wave. "Morning," Eli said. "Morning," Nate replied, unlocking the door. As the day began, Nate found himself watching Eli more closely. For the first time, he wondered what the kid's story really was, and whether he had been too quick to judge. The seeds of change had been planted, though Nate didn't yet realize it. By the following week, the chill of early November had settled firmly over Maple Hollow. A steady drizzle had turned the dirt paths to slick mud, and the gray skies seemed to stretch endlessly. Nate Hayes had grown used to the cold seeping into his bones, but today it felt heavier. At the workshop, the day started like any other. Nate was focused on finishing a carved mantelpiece for a client. The smell of freshly sanded pine filled the air as sawdust gathered around his boots. Eli Carter, the new helper, was stacking planks in the corner, his movements deliberate but quiet. Though Eli worked hard, Nate couldn't shake the feeling that the kid was holding something back. He was polite and diligent, but there was a tension in his posture, like he was always bracing for impact. That afternoon, as Nate and Eli cleaned up the workshop, Mr. Crandall stepped out of his office with a clipboard. "Hayes," he called, "need you to go into town and pick up some supplies. Eli, go with him. Be good for you to learn where we get our materials." Nate nodded reluctantly, grabbing his coat. He wasn't keen on the idea of spending the next hour making small talk with the kid, but Crandall's word was law. The drive into town was quiet. Nate focused on the road, while Eli stared out the window, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his hoodie. "Cold enough for you?" Nate asked gruffly, breaking the silence. Eli glanced over, surprised. "Yeah, feels like winter's coming early." Nate grunted in agreement, steering the truck toward the hardware store. They loaded up supplies quickly: wood glue, nails, and a few replacement tools for the workshop. As they carried the boxes back to the truck, the rain started up again, light at first, but quickly growing heavier. "Let's get these in before we're soaked," Nate muttered, picking up his pace. Eli followed, struggling slightly with the weight of the box he carried. By the time they finished, both were damp and winded. Nate climbed into the driver's seat and glanced over at Eli, who was shivering despite his hoodie. "You all right?" Nate asked, his tone brusque but not unkind. Eli nodded. "Yeah, just colder than I thought." Nate cranked the heater, and the truck rumbled to life. They drove in silence for a while, the rain drumming against the roof. Pedrufon. As they approached the outskirts of town, Nate noticed Eli glancing nervously at a small diner they passed, a place far less welcoming than Mark Donovan's. The building was run down, its neon sign flickering weakly. "You know that place?" Nate asked, his curiosity piqued. Eli's face tightened. "Used to. Not a fan, I take it." Eli hesitated, then shrugged. "Worked there for a while. Didn't end well." Nate didn't press, though the answer stayed with him. There was a story behind those words, but it was clear Eli wasn't ready to tell it. When they returned to the workshop, the rain was coming down harder. Nate parked the truck and hopped out, pulling his collar up against the cold. As they unloaded the supplies, he caught Eli rubbing his hands together, his breath visible in the damp air. "You should have worn gloves," Nate said. "Didn't think I'd need them," Eli replied, his voice defensive. Nate bit back a retort and finished unloading the truck. That evening, as Nate walked home, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. He passed by Rose Blake's florist shop and noticed the lights were still on, the warm glow spilling onto the wet cobblestones. Without thinking, he stepped inside. Rose looked up from behind the counter, her face lighting up. "Nate, what a surprise. Come in, you'll catch your death out there." "I'm fine," Nate said, brushing water from his jacket. Rose poured him a cup of tea without asking, handing it to him with a knowing smile. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one that says you're carrying more than you need to." Nate sighed, taking a sip of the tea. The warmth spread through him, easing the tension in his shoulders. "I've got this new guy at the workshop," he said finally. "Kid's a hard worker, but there's something off. Can't put my finger on it." Rose tilted her head, listening intently. "What do you mean by off?" "Like he's hiding something," Nate said. "I've been trying to figure him out, but I don't know. Maybe it's not my place." Rose chuckled softly. "Sometimes people just need someone to give them the benefit of the doubt. You never know what kind of battles they're fighting." Nate didn't respond, but her words settled heavily in his mind. Later that night, As Nate sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, he couldn't stop thinking about Eli. The kid's nervous glances, his guarded answers, it all pointed to something Nate knew too well, the fear of being judged. He thought back to his own youth, the mistakes he'd made, and the people who had written him off without a second thought. It wasn't a comfortable memory, but it was a necessary one. The rain outside had picked up again, tapping against the window like a restless heartbeat. Nate stood and walked to the closet, pulling out the old box of photographs he'd shoved back into the shadows. He opened it slowly, the smell of aged paper wafting up. The first photo was of his parents, standing side by side in front of the workshop they'd built together. His mother's soft smile and his father's proud stance felt like a lifetime ago. Beneath it was a picture of himself as a teenager, his face hardened by anger and defiance. He remembered the fights, the nights spent running from his problems, and the people who had dismissed him as a lost cause. But he also remembered the one man who hadn't, his father's old friend, Tom. Tom had offered him a job when no one else would, teaching him the craft of woodworking. It had been the lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Setting the photo aside, Nate leaned back in his chair, Rose's words echoing in his mind. You never know what kind of battles they're fighting. Maybe Eli wasn't just a new hire. Maybe he was someone who needed a lifeline too. The rain continued to fall as Nate stared at the photo, the weight of the past pressing against him. For the first time in years, he felt something begin to shift, a crack in the walls he'd built around himself. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. He owed Eli more than judgment. The morning after his rainy reflection, Nate Hayes arrived at the workshop with a newfound resolve. Though the cold November wind nipped at his face, he felt a spark of warmth in his chest, something like purpose. He wasn't entirely sure what he would do, but he knew he needed to try something different with Eli Carter. Inside, the familiar sounds of saws and hammers echoed in the workshop. Eli was already there, sweeping sawdust into neat piles. His movements were methodical, almost mechanical, but Nate noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Morning, kid," Nate said, his tone less gruff than usual. "Morning," Eli replied, glancing up briefly before returning to his task. Nate hesitated, then said, "You did good work yesterday. Crandall said the shelves you organized looked perfect." Eli paused mid-sweep, clearly startled by the compliment. "Thanks," he said softly, avoiding eye contact. The moment passed quickly, and Nate went to his station to begin sanding a new project. But as he worked, he found himself glancing at Eli, wondering what weight the kid was carrying, and whether Nate could do anything to help. Bored at lunch, Nate decided to break his routine. Instead of heading to the diner alone, he invited Eli to join him. "You eat yet?" Nate asked as Eli packed up his tools. Eli blinked, surprised. No, I was just gonna—" "Come on, I'll buy you a sandwich," Nate interrupted, grabbing his coat. Eli hesitated, then nodded, following Nate out the door. The diner was warm and lively, a welcome refuge from the biting wind outside. Mark Donovan greeted them as they entered, his booming voice carrying over the chatter of the lunchtime crowd. "Hayes, good to see you, and you brought company." "This is Eli," Nate said, gesturing to the younger man. "He just started at the workshop." "Welcome, Eli," Mark said with a broad smile. "First lunch here's on the house. House rules." Eli's face flushed. "Oh, you don't have to do that." "Not up for debate," Mark said, already scribbling their order on his notepad. They found a booth near the window, and for a while they ate in relative silence. Nate watched as Eli devoured his sandwich, the kid clearly hungrier than he let on. Finally, Nate broke the quiet. "You're doing all right at the workshop, but you look like you haven't slept in days. Everything okay?" Eli froze, his hands gripping his cup of water. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a lot going on lately." "Like what?" Nate pressed, keeping his tone casual. Eli hesitated, his eyes darting to the table. Just family stuff. It's nothing. Nate leaned back, studying him. You know, when I was your age, I didn't want to talk to anyone either. Thought I could handle everything on my own. Turns out I couldn't. Eli looked up, his expression guarded, but curious. What happened? Nate sighed, running a hand through his hair. Made a lot of mistakes. Let people down, but someone gave me a shot when no one else would. That's how I ended up at the workshop. For a moment, Eli said nothing. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, I didn't mean to mess things up at my last job, but my boss didn't want to hear excuses. He fired me on the spot. What happened? Eli shifted uncomfortably. I was late a few times. My mom's been sick, and I've been helping take care of her. I guess I wasn't keeping up with things like I should have. Nate's chest tightened. He recognized the strain in Eli's voice, the guilt of trying to juggle too much, the fear of not being enough. You tell Crandall about your situation? Nate asked. Eli shook his head. Didn't want to mess up this job, too. Nate nodded slowly. Look, Crandall's fair. If you need time for your mom, just let him know. He'd understand. I don't want him to think I'm slacking, Eli said, his voice firm but tinged with desperation. Nate didn't push further, but as they finished their meal, he found himself thinking about the struggles he'd faced at Eli's age and the people who had helped him through. That evening, after the workshop closed, Nate decided to stop by the diner again. Mark Donovan was wiping down the counter when Nate approached. Back already? Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. Need to talk, Nate said, sliding onto a stool. Mark set down his rag and leaned against the counter. What's on your mind? It's the new kid at the workshop, Eli. He's good, but he's got a lot going on. Sick mom, trouble at his last job. Reminds me of, well, me. Mark nodded thoughtfully. You think he needs help? Maybe, Nate admitted, but he's stubborn, doesn't want to ask for it. Mark chuckled. Sounds familiar. Nate smirked despite himself. Yeah. Guess I'm not great at asking for help either. None of us are, Hayes, Mark said, his tone serious now. But sometimes it's not about waiting for someone to ask. Sometimes you just have to step up and show them they're not alone. Nate thought about that as he walked home. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy. As he passed Rose's florist shop, he noticed the light was still on. He almost kept walking, but something made him stop. Inside, Rose was arranging a bouquet of autumn flowers, her hands moving deftly despite their age. She looked up and smiled as Nate entered. Twice in 1 week, she said warmly. To what do I owe the honor? Nate hesitated, then said, I need some advice. Rose set down the bouquet and gestured for him to sit. I'm listening. Nate told her about Eli, about the kid's struggles, his determination, and the walls he kept around himself. As he spoke, Rose nodded, her expression thoughtful. Kindness is like planting seeds, she said when he finished. You don't always see the results right away, but if you keep tending to them, something good will grow. Nate frowned. What if the seeds don't take? Rose smiled. Then you try again. And again. That's what it means to care for someone. And that night, as Nate sat alone in his kitchen, he thought about the bridges he'd burned in his youth and the ones others had built for him, even when he didn't deserve it. Eli Carter wasn't just a new hire. He was someone who needed a bridge, too. And Nate decided he would do his best to build it. The days grew shorter in Maple Hollow, the sun retreating earlier each evening as winter crept closer. Nate Hayes found himself staying later at the workshop, not because of unfinished projects, but because the place felt less lonely than home. The hum of saws, the rhythmic clinking of tools, it all grounded him in a way the silence of his house never could. Eli Carter's presence in the workshop had become part of that rhythm. The kid still worked hard, never complaining, but Nate could see the strain weighing on him. Every now and then, Eli's hands would falter, or his eyes would glaze over, lost in some thought he couldn't shake. One chilly morning, Nate arrived early to find Eli already at the bench, sanding down a piece of wood. His hands were steady, but his face was pale, and the dark circles under his eyes were deeper than usual. "You sleep at all last night?" Nate asked, hanging his coat by the door. Eli shrugged. "Not much. Mom had a bad night." Nate leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "You need to take a day off. Crandall'll understand." Eli shook his head, his voice firm. "I can't. We need the money, and I can't screw this up." Nate watched him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but if you keel over in the middle of the workshop, don't expect me to carry you to the hospital." Eli smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. As the week went on, Nate kept a closer eye on Eli, stepping in to help with heavier tasks and making sure the kid ate lunch each day. He wasn't one for overt kindness. It didn't come naturally, but he tried in small ways. A cup of coffee here, a quiet word of encouragement there. One evening, as they closed up the shop, Nate noticed Eli lingering by the door. "Something on your mind?" Nate asked, locking the workbench drawers. Eli hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I just wanted to say thanks. For, looking out for me." Nate raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to thank me. Just doing what someone did for me once." Eli looked down, his voice barely audible. "Not many people do, though." Nate didn't know how to respond, so he simply clapped Eli on the shoulder. "Get some rest, kid. Tomorrow's another long day." Eli nodded and headed out into the cold, his figure disappearing into the twilight. That weekend, Nate decided to take Mark Donovan's advice. If Eli wasn't going to ask for help, Nate would find another way to give it. He stopped by Rose's florist shop first, not for flowers, but for advice. Rose greeted him warmly, her hands full of delicate winter blooms. "You're becoming quite the regular," she teased. Nate chuckled. "Not here for tea this time. Got a kid at the workshop, Eli. He's in a rough spot and I want to help, but I don't want to overstep." Rose set down her flowers and tilted her head thoughtfully. "Sometimes the best way to help someone is to make them feel seen, not like a burden, but like they matter." Nate frowned. "How do I do that?" Rose smiled. "You're already doing it, Nate. You're showing up. Keep doing that, and the rest will follow." The next day, Nate went to the hardware store and picked up a small toolbox. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, with enough compartments for someone just starting out. Back at the workshop, he filled it with a set of quality tools: a hammer, a chisel, a tape measure, and a few other essentials. When Eli arrived that morning, Nate handed him the toolbox without a word. Eli blinked in surprise, staring at the gift. "What's this for?" "Every carpenter needs their own tools," Nate said simply. Eli opened the box, running his fingers over the smooth handles of the tools inside. For a moment, he didn't speak, his throat working as if he was trying to swallow something heavy. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't make a big deal out of it," Nate grumbled, turning back to his workbench, but he couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Over the next few weeks, Nate noticed a change in Eli. The kid seemed more confident, his shoulders less hunched, his movements more assured. He still worked hard, but now there was a spark of pride in his efforts, a sense that he was building something, not just getting by. Nate, too, felt something shift within himself. For years, he'd kept people at arm's length, afraid of the vulnerability that came with connection. But helping Eli reminded him of the kindness he'd once received, the way it had changed his life. One evening, as they locked up the shop, Eli turned to Nate. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd find a place like this. People like Crandall, Like you've given me a chance I didn't think I deserved. Nate met his gaze, his voice steady. Everyone deserves a chance, Eli. Sometimes more than one. Eli nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll make it count. Nate believed him. That night, as Nate walked home under a clear, star-filled sky, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Helping Eli wasn't just about the kid. It was about redemption, about proving to himself that he could still make a difference. Rose's words came back to him. Sometimes, the best way to help someone is to make them feel seen. Winter's grip tightened on Maple Hollow as December rolled in. The first heavy snow blanketed the town, muffling its sounds and slowing its pace. At the workshop, the chill crept in through the old wooden walls, despite the heaters that hummed steadily in the corners. Nate Hayes found himself growing accustomed to having Eli Carter around. The kid had become part of the fabric of their daily routine, his quiet determination adding a steady rhythm to the shop's bustling work. But something about Eli still felt fragile, as if he were balancing on a tightrope, trying desperately not to fall. Basu, one morning, just as the workshop opened, Nate noticed Eli wasn't at his usual spot. Normally the kid arrived early, eager to get started, but today his workbench was empty. "Where's Eli?" Nate asked Mr. Crandall, who was poring over the day's orders. "Haven't seen him," Crandall replied, frowning. "Not like him to be late." Nate tried to focus on his own tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Eli. By noon, when the kid still hadn't shown up, Nate's worry deepened. "I'll head over to his place," Nate said to Crandall. "Make sure everything's all right." Crandall nodded. "Good idea. Let me know if he needs anything." Eli lived on the edge of town in a small, run-down apartment complex. The building's exterior was chipped and weathered, its once bright paint faded to a dull gray. Nate climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor and knocked on Eli's door. For a long moment, there was no answer. Just as Nate was about to knock again, the door opened a crack, and Eli's pale face appeared. "Hey, kid," Nate said, relieved but concerned. "You okay?" Eli hesitated, then opened the door wider. He looked exhausted, his hair disheveled, and his hoodie hung loose on his thin frame. "Sorry I didn't call," Eli mumbled. "Mom's been worse. I didn't want to leave her." Nate stepped inside, taking in the small, cluttered apartment. A worn couch sat against one wall, and a small table was covered with empty pill bottles and crumpled tissues. In the corner, a frail woman lay on a makeshift bed, her breathing shallow. "She's been sick all night," Eli said, his voice tight with worry. "I didn't know what to do." Nate crouched by the woman's bedside, his own heart tightening at the sight of her. Her face was gaunt, her skin ashen. "She needs a doctor, Eli," Nate said gently. "I can't afford it," Eli replied, his voice breaking. "We're barely making rent as it is. The meds alone are killing us." Nate stood and placed a firm hand on Eli's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone. Let's get her to the clinic. I'll take care of the bill." Eli's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that, Nate. I can't ask you—" "You're not asking," Nate interrupted. "I'm offering. Come on, kid. Let's go." The local clinic was small but well-equipped. Nate helped Eli get his mother into the truck, and they drove through the snow in tense silence. At the clinic, the nurse took one look at the woman and rushed her into a treatment room. As they waited, Eli paced the lobby, his hands shaking. Nate sat nearby, watching him with a mix of concern and admiration. "You did the right thing, bringing her here," Nate said finally. Eli stopped pacing and slumped into a chair. "I feel like I've been failing her. She worked so hard to raise me, and now I can't even take care of her." "Eli," Nate said, his voice steady, "you're doing more than most people your age would, but you can't carry this weight by yourself. Sometimes Letting people help isn't weakness. It's strength. Eli didn't respond, but Nate could see the words sinking in. Hours later, the doctor emerged, his expression reassuring. "She's stable," he said. "Pneumonia, but we caught it in time. She'll need rest and proper medication, but she should recover." Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he whispered. "She's lucky to have a son who cares so much," the doctor said with a smile. Nate stepped forward. "I'll handle the payment. Just tell us what she needs." By the time they returned to Eli's apartment, it was late. Nate helped Eli set up a more comfortable space for his mother, arranging her medicine and making sure she had plenty of blankets. As they worked, Eli finally opened up. "After Dad left, it was just me and her," he said, his voice low. "She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, but her health's been getting worse for years. I've been trying to keep things together, but it feels like it's all falling apart." Nate listened quietly, his heart aching for the kid. "You've been carrying more than your share, Eli, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." Eli looked up, his eyes glistening. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me that well." Nate hesitated, then said, "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it, and because I see a lot of myself in you." Eli nodded slowly, his guard finally lowering. The next morning, Nate arrived at the workshop early, his mind heavy with thoughts of Eli and his mother. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the people who had shaped him, the ones who had built bridges when he thought all was lost. By the time Eli arrived, his steps a little steadier, Nate felt a sense of clarity. "You good to work today?" Nate asked. Eli nodded. "Yeah, Mom's doing better, thanks to you." "Not just me," Nate said. "You did the hard part. Now, let's get to work." As the day went on, the tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet camaraderie. Nate saw in Eli not just a young man struggling to find his way, but a reflection of his own journey, proof that even the heaviest burdens could be shared. In helping Eli, Nate felt his own walls begin to crumble. The distance he'd kept from others for so long no longer felt necessary. Compassion, he realized, wasn't just a gift for the receiver, it was a lifeline for the giver too. December deepened, bringing with it the crisp stillness of winter. Snow blanketed Maple Hollow in soft white, the rooftops glistening under the pale sunlight. For the first time in years, Nate Hayes felt a kind of peace he hadn't known since his youth, a sense that he wasn't simply existing, but living. At the workshop, things had fallen into an easy rhythm. Eli Carter had found his footing, his confidence growing with each passing day. The kid still worked tirelessly, but he smiled more now, joked occasionally, and carried himself with a quiet pride. One Friday afternoon, as Nate sanded the final edges of a custom table, Mr. Crandall called him into the office. "Nate," Crandall began, leaning back in his chair, "I've been watching you these past few weeks with Eli. You've taken him under your wing, and it's made a difference, for him and for this place." Nate scratched the back of his neck, feeling a little self-conscious. "Just doing what needed to be done." Crandall smiled. "It's more than that. I think you've got a knack for mentoring. Have you ever thought about stepping up? Maybe running the shop someday?" The question caught Nate off guard. For years, he'd seen himself as just another set of hands, someone who worked quietly in the background. "I don't know," he said hesitantly. "I've never been much of a leader." "Maybe not in the traditional sense," Crandall said. "But leadership isn't about barking orders. It's about building others up, and you've done that with Eli. Think about it." The idea stayed with Nate as he walked home that evening. The streets of Maple Hollow were quiet, the snow muffling the sounds of the world. Lights twinkled in the windows of the small shops along Main Street, casting a warm glow over the town. Nate stopped by the florist's shop, where Rose Blake was busy arranging holiday bouquets. "Evening, Rose," he said as he stepped inside. "Nate, good to see you," Rose replied, her face lighting up. "What brings you by?" "Just wanted to say thanks," Nate said, "for all the advice these past few weeks. It's helped." Rose smiled warmly. "You've done the hard work, Nate. I just gave you a little nudge." "Maybe," Nate said, glancing at the vibrant flowers around him. "But it's good to know someone's got your back." Rose's expression softened. "We all need that, Nate. And from what I hear, you've become that person for someone else." Nate thought of Eli, of the weight the kid had carried, and the courage he'd shown in facing it. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I guess I have." The following week, Nate and Eli worked side by side on a large order for a local cafe. The job was tedious, requiring careful measurements and precise cuts, but Eli tackled it with a focus that impressed Nate. "You're getting good at this," Nate said as they fitted the final piece of a table. Eli grinned. "Got a good teacher." Nate smirked. "Don't let it go to your head." Eli laughed, the sound light and genuine. It was a sound Nate hadn't heard from him before, and it filled the workshop with an unexpected warmth. That weekend, Nate decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out the old box of photographs he'd been avoiding, this time without hesitation. The first picture he picked up was the one of his parents in front of the workshop. He studied their faces, the pride in his father's eyes, the quiet strength in his mother's smile. Beneath it was a photo of himself as a teenager, standing next to Tom, his father's old friend. Tom had been the one to take a chance on him, to teach him the craft of woodworking and show him a path forward when Nate couldn't see one for himself. Nate set the photo aside, his chest tight with emotion. He realized now that helping Eli was more than just a way to repay a debt. It was a way to honor the people who had believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. On Christmas Eve, the workshop closed early, and Crandall invited everyone to the diner for a holiday meal. The place was packed with familiar faces, the air filled with laughter and the smell of roasted turkey. Nate sat at a booth with Eli, who had brought his mother along. She was still frail, but her color had returned, and her smile was warm and genuine. As the meal wound down, Mark Donovan stood and raised a glass. "To the people who make Maple Hollow what it is, a place where we look out for each other," he said. "And to second chances, because we all need them." The room erupted in cheers, and Nate found himself smiling. Later that night, as he walked home under a sky full of stars, Nate felt something shift within him. The walls he'd built around himself, the weight he'd carried for so long, it was lighter now, easier to bear. Helping Eli hadn't just changed the kid's life, it had changed Nate's too. The new year dawned bright and clear, and with it came new possibilities. Nate didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace it. He thought of the bridges he'd built, the seeds of kindness he'd planted, and the unexpected hope that had grown from them. And as he stepped into the workshop that morning, the smell of sawdust and fresh beginnings in the air, Nate Hayes smiled. It was a new day,